Hi, everybody. I'm finally back with Richard Rudd to do the Venus sequence of the gene keys. And I know many of you have been waiting quite a long time for this. I'm excited. And one of the things that really intrigues me here is Richard says that our life is shaped by the years between 14 and 21 when it comes to our relationships, especially our closest relationships. So thinking back, what was your life like between 14 and 21? Who were the major influences? What did you do? How did you feel? This is going to come up in the conversation today. So let's go to Richard to get further into it. Hi, Richard.
Hi, lovely to be here.
It's we've waited a few months on this one to keep people dangling, and I've had requests. When are you going to have Richard back on again to do the Venus sequence? Because you know what? The thing that's being challenged most in the world right now, I think, with all of the intense energies is our human relationships. People are just scrambling to and hanging on by their fingernails, trying to figure out how to relate to each other. And there are a lot of factors involved in that. So would you agree that that's really the big one?
I think so. I think it's maybe always been that way, but I absolutely agree. I think when crisis comes, that is the area that people really struggle with.
Yes. And there's something in this. I'm going to read something very quickly before we go into it, because I just loved it when I read this in your book. And of course, this is the Venus sequence. Okay. So I'm on page 89 here, and it says the idea that we can continually integrate our childhood, even as we age, is what leads to a very fulsome life. There are gifts we had as teenagers that we may have forgotten. I love that, because in many schools of thought is leave childlike things and childish things behind. You have to grow up and move away from the inclinations of your youth and your teenage years to be an adult, to woman up, to man up. You're saying, no. So please explain that a little bit before we get into it, because we're going to look at your chart.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like this kind of idea that we are multi-aged. We are not one age. We are all the ages we've ever been, so, there's times where we're 4 and there's times when we're 12 and there's times when we're, 22 and we're all of those ages. And so the way I have understood things or formulated things through the gene keys and through particularly this Venus sequence is it's a little bit inspired by some of the early works of Rudolf Steiner, who obviously was the founder of all the Waldorf schools around the country and around the world.
Big fan.
Yeah, yes. Me too. My children have been to some of his schools.
My son as well. Yes.
Yeah, and what Steiner kind of put forward is this notion of the 7-year cycles. It's not an unknown notion that we live in 7-year cycles, and that our cells of our body are reformatted. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are reformatted every 7 years. So we have a new body every 7 years, essentially. And so what he proposes that these 3 7-year cycles of our childhood, so the first one up to 7 or 8, and then which is the form which he applied to our physical being, the will, the power of the divine will, if you like, and as it shaped us and as it shaped our organs and we grow. And then the second one from 8 to 14, puberty, that really strongly relating to our emotional life, or some call our astral life. And then the third 7-year cycle from 14 to 21, our teenage cycle, our mental development. Now that doesn't, when I say that, it doesn't, the mental is there all along, the emotional is there all along, the physical is there all along. So these are broad brushstrokes, but the more deeply you go into that, you realize there's really something in it. So when you mention the third 7-year cycle of imprinting, the teenage cycle, that is where the neurology of the brain is absolutely opening up, and so there are new neurons potentially firing all over the place as that brain expands. And so recapturing some of that magic, of that time of magic, is really important and keeps us younger, so the Venus sequence is all about what happened to you in that cycle, and where were the places that you maybe shut down defensively, or where that mind begun to calcify in certain areas, and how has that carried on in your life? So what opinions have formed that kind of actually prevent you from experiencing deeper love or deeper empathy, those kind of things. So it's really interesting looking into the Venus sequence, because it is this journey back into what makes us tick, literally.
Oh my God. Yeah. As I was prepping for this, and I thought, because I love your Art of Contemplation book. Everybody in the world should have a copy of it, honestly. Anybody that doesn't have one, please, before you do anything, even before the Gene Keys, you've got to get the Art of Contemplation, so you lay the foundation for being able to absorb all of this. And so I contemplated, and I've got to say, this is kind of a vulnerable thing to say, but I thought 14 to 21. First of all, at 14, I had my first boyfriend till 18. And everything was about whatever we did together. Romeo and Juliet kind of idealized love that was living in the flesh. And that became really a template for what later has become a challenge in relationships. In my case, for example, that feeling of intoxication is in your chart and mine. So that's one type. So for you, tell us about your 14 to 21 and how that shaped you.
Yeah, I guess for many of us, we're at school or in some institution. Not all of us, but for many. And
were you in private school? And
I was.
Was it integrated, boys, or just?
There were some girls. It was pretty privileged male.
Yeah. I can imagine. I know the scene.
So not too healthy.
Oh.
And I guess a lot of intellectual stimulation, overstimulation, and so I guess for me it was a time of my keys were 15. My key there is 59 and 59 line 1, and that relates to, what we say in the Venus sequence is that's the development of our IQ, so our IQ really forms itself. So our intellectual intelligence, our mental intelligence really crystallizes in those years. And obviously that is when we are in education, many of us, as I said, but also it's founded upon our earlier cycle, which the puberty cycle, which is that second 7-year cycle, where our EQ is really forming. So the basis of our emotional intelligence, and that depends highly on our parents and how we were kind of held by our parents, and maybe in early schools and those kind of things, and how we handled our puberty years and sexuality. That whole phase. So for me, it was a time of trying to keep that kind of soft heart part of me still alive.
Ooh, that's hard in British public schools.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So for my way, I think I've managed to just about keep it alive by I was in a boarding school, and so my thing was I sneaked out often into nature. And it's like I was a bit of an anomaly, because most of the boys were sneaking out to kind of have cigarettes or something. I was sneaking out to commune with nature, just to be out
trees,
be out like in the field, where I got a real ecstatic hit. So people were, if once or twice when I was caught, people assumed I was like doing something bad, and they wouldn't, it's like not like I could say I'm here because I need my hit from nature. But anyway, that was one of the ways I tried to keep it alive. But for many of us, it's such a difficult period, that teen cycle. It's so challenging, and understanding how it was for you and what happened to you is so key. It's not something you can just do. No. As you said, it's contemplation. You have to contemplate back what happened to me. Sometimes we draw mind maps and things and memory maps to kind of and maps of in the Venus sequences. Sometimes we draw maps of like the figures who influenced us in our life most. It's really interesting to see whether they were teachers, or maybe they were uncles or aunts, or friends, or friends of the family, or who impacted us in a healthy way and in an unhealthy way. And tracking all that gives you a sense of, these are the sort of mentor figures that stalked your brain, your brain development, and what teachers inspired you and which teachers didn't inspire you, shut you down, or you felt bored or trapped, or all of that is part of that cycle. And as you said, the relationships, the sexuality, the insecurity, the inadequacy, all those feelings welling up, and then that coming through the brain. So when you look at your gene keys and you're looking in the Venus sequence, you're looking at specific places where they're called keys for a reason, where doors can be opened or reopened through, and the memory can come back, and the neural pathways that weren't allowed to fully develop can now develop. They can open up again, even if you're 80. You can suddenly find all these neural pathways that you shut down or were shut down because of something that happened, or a field that you found yourself in, and then they open up again
by simply rediscovering them. Or obviously I think you would have to apply some consciousness to it, right?
Well, yeah, that's what the keys are. The gene keys are very specific algorithms, the very specific key that you'll have a key, one of 64 and a one of 6 lines.
Yes.
And that's a very specific code. So when you understand what that code means and you contemplate it, and you contemplate the shadow of that gene key, or, so mine, as an example, was 59, and that's about dishonesty. The shadow is dishonesty. So that often means dishonest with oneself, or you're facing dishonesty or something. Anyway, something shuts down, and then what's hidden behind that is intimacy. So intimacy then shuts down because of that dishonesty, and then the beauty of the transparency is lost. So there's a whole story for each person that helps them to unlock what was it that kind of caused a lock, and it was a protective mechanism. It's always a defense mechanism that's trying to protect ourselves from the suffering of the world. And so what was your mental lock is really key. And then you go deeper in the Venus sequence, and you go as you get past the mental lock, you open up the floodgate of that memory, and then you get to the emotional lock, which lies deeper because it lies in that earlier cycle. It might have been something that happened when you were 8 or 9 or 7, and it might not have been a single thing. It might have just been a whole, period that slowly shut you down in some way. And so then you go into that deeper lock of the emotional lock. It's a floodgate. And when you open up that floodgate through this deep contemplation work with the gene keys, then
you're talking about the EQ, essentially, the EQ on the chart, which people are just seeing there. Yeah. And I was just looking at your EQ. Your EQ is based on a consciousness level, bounteousness and competence, but then also compromise.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's
have you had to compromise a lot in your life emotionally?
For sure. I was sent to a boarding school.
That's a big one.
And so when you're cut off from the mother's love at that age, for me it was at the age of 7 or 8. So it was exactly at the beginning of that cycle. You begin to see these patterns. When you understand your algorithms, you really begin to see why the things happen to you the way they happened. And seeing why, you're like, wow, it was all kind of meant to be that way. And even though it was horrible and painful in some way, you realize that there's a gift in it. And so, but you also have to kind of see the pattern enacting today. And you don't have to look any further than your relationships to see it. So the moment you look in your relationships, there it is. There's the compromise. There's the emotional compromise for me. And so it's me giving away my power, or it's me overexerting my power, my emotional power, to try and stay in control of something. Mm-hmm. Those are the patterns. So when you really understand your specific emotional patterns, you can disable them, and then as you disable them through that self-awareness, then you the true emotion of that time, that bounteousness in my case, starts to come back, and the heart starts to open again. You start to feel emotionally capable again instead of emotionally illiterate. Yeah, that's what we mean by having a high EQ.
Yeah.
You develop your emotional intelligence.
Yeah. And I'm just looking at the same time as you're speaking about this, the compromise that emotionally you had to overcome. I look at mine, and mine was bliss and vitality, key number 58, right? And that is how I felt in those young years. I was blissed out a lot of the time. I didn't care much about academic pursuits at all. It was I think partly because I was very, very bored. Everything moved so slowly. So poetry and art and science were okay. I couldn't function well with the rest of it. It was just too slow, where you were forced to have to deal with that. You could not, in that environment, not do your work. Whole different system. So I could be blissed out dancing and with my boyfriend every day, having a lovely time. So we had quite opposite types of EQ experiences.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And IQ experiences.
Yeah.
So the way these lines move when we're looking at the chart, and everybody's seeing this anyway, does it go first from the IQ to the EQ? How does it move direction?
Yeah, because it's like it's really interesting actually, these 3 7-year cycles of imprinting. The physical in the first 7 years, the emotional in the second 7 years, the mental in the third 7 years. That's our whole childhood, right? Up to adulthood, right? And then the 3 trimesters of the womb are also in each of those trimesters is connected to each of one of those cycles. So the first trimester is the first 7 years, the second 7 years, the third. So you have this incredible kind of trinity kind of programming pattern that's bound, that is wound into every single human being. Doesn't matter whether you were born early or anything like that. Because it's about it might make a difference at some level if you came out early, because that third trimester, it would be cut short in some way. But then that would also be part of your storyline. So when you look at the gene keys of each of your those periods that relate to those times, you get to unpick the weave of this story. So those gene keys, you start with the IQ because it's nearer the surface, and it's the mental.
That's going here, and then over to the EQ, and then where do we go from there? And
then from there to what we call the SQ. And the SQ is like our spiritual intelligence or our soul intelligence, because it's the first 7 years of our lives. And the first 7 years of our lives are when literally our organs are developing and we are learning to be in a body. This is all incarnation, right? We're still incarnating when we're 21, actually. We're just kind of closing that series. We're still coming in. And for many people, but because of these locks and things, people don't fully come in because it's too frightening. So the lock cuts us off maybe emotionally, or it cuts us off physically. So a part of our soul doesn't get to arrive. It stays outside the body. And so this is why it's like really profound working with the Venus sequence, because as you work with it, more of your soul starts to inhabit your body. It starts to inhabit your emotional life. It starts to inhabit your physical life. So you get more vitality coming back to you. You get more of that childlike wonder. You get more of that open-hearted.
That is so critical.
Yeah,
that is critical, because upon incarnation, it is such a challenging life that lies ahead for every soul who incarnates to Earth. There's even the best of lives. It's just challenging. We're sandwiched between the dimensions of the lighter and the darker, and so every single thing that we experience is going to pull us, conscious on a consciousness scale, one direction or the other. So I can understand why people would hesitate and say, "Nah, I'll just put my foot in the water." And you're saying that's what a lot of people are doing between the ages of 1 and 7 when they're developing. They just have a pinky in it, in the game, and they haven't fully embodied.
Yes, because something, again, in the first trimester, when you were in the womb, because when you're in the womb, you're just floating, right? You're absolutely transparent. We now know this through science, like the as those senses are coming online, as those little tiny organs are developing, everything that the mother feels, senses, thinks, is moving through the child.
Mm-hmm.
And the environment around the mother is moving through the child. The life force of all the beings around is moving. The sound environment, the audio, the smell, it's all moving through this transparent, tiny fetus. And so everything that comes in is kind of programming a storyline, an allegory to unfold in that child's life. Their dharma, the ancients call that, the dharma. So it's all at some level, it's preloaded in, because everything kind of happens in its coordinated timing and its choreography. So even things that are very difficult, let's say you're born in the middle of a war, or a war zone or something, and that comes into the fetus, or let's say your parents have a really blazing row at some point in with the in the fetus, that goes straight into the child, and it's wound into the organ system. So it then shows later at that exact same place in the cycle, and then it reoccurs again in the next cycle and the next cycle. But at a different fractal level. So you have these kind of wound patterns that are repeating in a kind of logarithmic. It's very mathematical. These are algorithms, the algorithms of our wounding, right? But they're also the algorithms of our awakening. So we have to understand their sequence. That's why it's called the Venus sequence. Because it's
that makes
unfolding.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking then, in this period of time, with all we're absorbing in the womb, might this be also associated with kind of the classic understanding in Chinese medicine and other systems that, for example, the liver has to do with anger, the lungs have to do with grief? Is this how it might start programming the body then? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yeah. Whichever system you look through, you're going to see the same story, but through a different lens.
Mm-hmm.
If it's Chinese medicine, you're looking at it through the 5-element cycle, and it's wound into that cycle. So if there's a kind of break in the cycle in some way, it gets passed on from one element to the other, from one organ to the next, and then you have these feedback loops that are kind of trapping us in certain patterns. Mm-hmm. And those patterns ultimately are they're cellular, they're memory implants, or the ancients call them sanskaras, the Indians, from the Vedas. Sanskaras are like wound plates or wound slates in our subtle bodies. But they're also wound opportunities. They're wormholes to higher states of consciousness. And that's the secret of the Venus sequence, that it's a wound map. There aren't many things that give us that level of a map of our wounding. And most people wouldn't want to look there.
That is
but
true.
If you realize that your wound opportunities are wormholes to higher states of consciousness, you really want to go there, and you want to know about them, and you want to understand them, and you want to contemplate them, and you want to kind of unlock them. And that's what the Venus sequence is all about. It's incredible.
That's the beauty of Gene Keys across the board, is exactly the shadow all the way through to the gift. I hope you're enjoying this video, because if you are, there are dozens more like it on my site, all supported by people like you. So if you'd like to keep this work rolling in and join our community, just click on the Patreon button at reginameredith.com. That also gives you access to insider commentary, my live book club, and other live events with special guests. So join in. Thanks. So we were just looking at the SQ, which is the spiritual quotient, which you say begins developing from birth to the age of 7. And in your case and my case, so you can cover it for both of us, we both have key number 56, which is intoxication, enrichment, and then distraction. So maybe just briefly, I do understand the intoxication part well and the distraction part well. So go ahead and talk about it for yourself.
Yeah, for me, I think, when you look at your SQ, you're looking at a place of pure innocence. The first 7 years of your life, you're looking at the essence that your soul is here to convey out to the world. And it's carrying something from another realm. So if you have an essence like intoxication, 56, then it's going to kind of, it is a kind of prevalence for blissful states or higher states. And like I said, later in my 3rd 7-year cycle, I sought out places where I could feel those states, but I didn't know what it was I was doing.
Yeah.
And for some people, they would shut down earlier, and they would, for many people, we forget those states much earlier. I was fortunate in some respect that, but I think I was destined to kind of hold on to those states a little bit so I could become a teacher of these things. But it doesn't mean I suffered any less. Anyway, if you have one of those, like the SQ is the soul essence, wherever you look at your SQ, I mean, if you're looking at your profile now and look at that single SQ, it's the most powerful place in your kind of soul's life to really understand, especially that higher gift, that intoxication, because as you open up your faculties again, that's what wants to come out into the world. That's what wants to be shared. And the gift of that is the gift of enrichment, which is, overcoming the distractions of the world that pull you out through your senses and out, to escape your suffering. And the enrichment is actually about going into the suffering and into the source of the suffering and drawing the riches out, so that through that process is where you get to intoxication, or you arrive at higher states. So that has, and it doesn't, it never stops. That's my, and you, 56, those keys will always be with us, and every key has a mythology to it. And this SQ is specifically connected to our mythology, the EQ to our ideology, and the IQ to our psychology. So they're layers of our being, but our mythology is much deeper than our psychology, for example. It's what we've come in with from past existences. And so our myth, if you have a 56 as a myth, the 56 is all those mythologies of like, when they're like the gods that, or the deities that get intoxicated by the divine toxins, they're the bacchanalian gods. Or I ended up as a wine merchant's son, and being a wine connoisseur, the toxin and spirits, So the jokes of our mythology, when we really understand it, are beautiful.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I think back on it. So, okay, so I'll just briefly share my bit. So I had a break-in with family at 2 that would be considered a severe break with family. I was in the family, but I was in a bubble from that point on. I only trusted myself. When I had made my own decisions, I was a free agent from the age of 2, pretty much. And so what my life was about is I don't remember feeling those feelings per se of being separate, but what I do remember is feeling, okay, where's the smoothest concrete to roller skate today? Where can I pick some flowers and make little lays? Where can I, if it was raining out, I wanted to do a painting or a drawing. And I did poetry as well. And so for me, it was always about, and dance was probably at the center of it. I went to a neighbor's house and lusted after. At 5, they had a coffee table book of ballet. And I asked if I could borrow it and went home and taught myself the basic 5 positions and such. And so here we are all these years later, and in stressful times, I'm immediately right back in dance, salsa, tango, feeling the ecstasy of the dances. So I'm thinking that key may have been key in taking a difficult situation and day to day, just finding the intoxication amidst all of that.
Yeah. I mean, the 56, its mythology is really about diving into life. Yeah. It's about diving into life. It's not about escaping or transcending. Yeah. You might transcend by going in. So you go into the toxins of the world. You don't shy away from them. This is not a purification path. It's a tantra path, where you dive into things. And you can recognize that 56 in anyone when you meet them. I have many in my business who I work with who carry that same key, and There's a certain quality to us.
Yes.
Like,
Well, there is. It's like full tilt.
Yeah.
I scare my tango partners. I show up with
Right.
too much energy.
I love it.
Okay, so
Yeah.
now we go from the SQ. Where do we go from there directionally?
Yeah, you go across one more to what's called the core wound, and we just call it the core sometimes. And it's such a powerful place. And when you get to that level,
So I'm looking at your chart. It doesn't call it. It doesn't.
It probably calls it, and they might call it vocation.
Vocation. I see, right. Vocation. We've got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Your vocation 57.
Because in the profile, you know, you have these sequences and they turn into other sequences. They flow. And so the vocation is the beginning of the next sequence called the Pearl sequence, which is another whole journey. But in the Venus sequence, it's known as the core or the core wound. So we don't write them all on the profile itself. But when you study and go into and contemplate each sequence, you learn the codes. So that pathway, because the pathways have names as well, the pathway between the SQ and the core wound is called the pathway of realization. It's a very special, you know, and these pathways are like natural organic flowerings of consciousness in human beings. So as we walk these paths, as you walk deeply into your own suffering, everyone comes to that pathway of realization. You know, so you can't get to realization without going through your suffering. It's not possible. Okay. Yep. It's like, that's what the Buddha taught. That's what the great teachers have always taught. So that pathway is a really key, deep pathway, because it leads from the point of birth, which is what the SQ represents, birth coming out into the seven-year cycle, and it leads into the 9-month cycle of the womb and conception. So it takes us to the point of conception. This is in our memory. This is in our awareness, not necessarily our conscious memory. And for our awareness to travel back to the point of our conception, not our memory necessarily, but our awareness, is to come to full enlightenment or full awakening. You have to get back to that singularity of that point of conception in your awareness. And that's why the enlightened state is always described in that way, as like an empty state or a singularity, you know, where all identification is lost, because you're no longer even a fetus. You know, you're just a moment in, you know, you're an explosion, a supernova. You know, it's a beautiful mirroring of the beginning of the universe. The point of conception, it's a Big Bang. Literally. Indeed. Yeah. Indeed. So it's a mimicking of the Big Bang. And in that moment, your soul crystallized, you know, through DNA from your parents, but it crystallized and it fully started to kind of open its petals and then come into this incarnator form. So for the awareness to travel back to the core wound, you know, when you really understand the pattern of your core wound, you really begin to understand, even deeper than your mythology, you know, a kind of alchemy that you're here to bring to the world. That's why we call it your vocation. Yeah. So in your case, it's key number 57, and you're talking clarity, intuition, and then unease as the shadow. Unease. Yeah. So when you come to the core wound, the lines also become very important. Yes. And you're line one. Yeah. So when you look into, as you're studying your Venus sequence, you're going into it, you're looking into these lines and you go very deep into each of the lines. And so a line 1 wound is a wound of repression. It's a wound based on fear, you know, and a line 2 is a wound of anger, of denial. A line 3 is a wound of shame. A line 4 is a wound of rejection. A line 5 is a wound of guilt. A line 6 is a wound of isolation and separation. So these are like the core wounds of humanity, and they get, the deeper you go into them, you realize they don't even stop in individuals. The 6 lines also the racial wound patterns as well. They become invasion and they become colonization, and there's the same algorithms traveling into the racial gene pool, the individual gene pool, our emotional life, our mental life. It's all like when you come into the Venus sequence and you really, it's like a 9-month minimum exploration to begin to grasp it. But as you grasp the algorithms, not necessarily intellectually, because it's not about that, you realize everything in this world is just patterned and coded. That's why the ancients called it a Maya, because it's a matrix. It's a matrix ruled by numbers, our days are numbered,
Yes.
So there's a beautiful mathematics to the Venus sequence that's so precise, because it shows us this karma that we've brought with us. So when you understand you're a line 1 wound, then you're holding a core wound of fear for humanity. You realize that's the deepest thing you're going to have to work with your whole life. So I don't know which one line number are you?
My line is, I am 28-3. So
You're 3. I thought you were 3.
28-3. So what would that be in a nutshell?
Well, the 3, if we put aside the gene key for a moment, just looking at the lines, because they're so, they give us so much information, that the line 3 wounds are shame. Mm-hmm. But this isn't like personal, this is cosmic shame. Yeah. It's like cosmic fear. Like the line 1 is repression. So you're going to see in me a fundamental, when I am threatened, when I feel threatened in my being, I'm going to repress. I'm going to hide. I'm going to contract. In a 3rd line, when you feel threatened, you're going to run. Because it's a very different pattern.
Yeah.
If you're a 2nd line, you're going to attack. You're going to lash out. They're very. If you're a 4th line, you're going to kind of become incredibly armored. If you're a 5th line, you're going to try and manipulate your way out. And if you're a 6th line, you're not even going to be present. You're going to kind of separate yourself entirely from the situation and stand above it, like maybe go up into your head and like intellectually try and deal with it.
Yes.
So these are the different ways in which core wounds manifest. So when you understand yours and you go, oh my God, that is exactly how I behave, really revealing. And knowing these core wounds and knowing there's only 6 in the world, you can, even without knowing people's sequence, you see them everywhere. So in your partner, you'll see, once you read all the 6 lines, you'll see immediately which, without knowing their profile, you don't need to, you'll just know which one they are. because it's the pattern that always, it's the pattern you always meet. So if you're a 3rd line wound, the 3rd line is escapist. It tries to, it's because it's shame, and shame tries to escape. Mm-hmm. Tries to escape itself, escape feeling, doesn't want to feel its shame. It doesn't want to feel that, but it's the shame of being born. It's the shame of the mother. It's the shame of the elders, of the ancestors. It's the shame of, it's cosmic shame. And so you carry that, and then you have to play that out in some way in your life. And maybe you see it in your children, and maybe you find it around you, and it's a story to unlock. But it can also be a beautiful story, because behind that shame lies incredible compassion. So each of the lines has a gift. So you can turn it.
As you're talking, no, that makes perfect sense. And as you're talking, what I'm thinking is, I wonder if that great sense, that cosmic down to personal sense of shame might also feed into. I can be very easily manipulated to feel guilty for things I haven't even done. Guilt has to be part of shame.
Absolutely, they're connected. They're always connected.
Yeah.
You just like if I'm kind of talking to a 3rd line person, or someone who's in a relationship with a 3rd line wound, I would kind of counsel them. I'd say, look, you're living with a person that always needs to know there's a back door,
Yeah.
And if you give them the freedom, if the 3rd line feels free, they will relax. If they feel that some way someone is going to trap them, they get very, very nervous, and
that's true.
They can't be with you. They can't be open.
Yeah.
so each of the lines has a different way. You have to handle
Interesting.
them in different
So,
ways.
and this is something, I mean, we're just touching the surface
Yeah.
of all of these in this interview right now. However, it's so delightful for each person to go through and in their own quiet time contemplate every one of these. So now we go here. We have not talked about attraction in the Venus sequence. So the attraction, does that come from the IQ that can go downward as well?
Yeah, the attraction is, yeah, it's sort of earlier in the sequence. So you attract in the exact partner that you need to work on your wound, right? So this whole thing about the law of attraction, you attract the wound that you need from that person, and it's beautiful because you might attract some lovely person and they may, and you fall in love and all that, but actually you're also attracting in an energy that you need to learn from, so that you can understand your wound and forgive yourself more clearly. It's a very different way of looking at relationships. It means that there's no mistakes in the attractor field. The attractor field is kind of rigged from the beginning, which is why you look at that gene key and that line and you'll see how your attractor field is rigged. And if you're operating at a lower frequency, that attractor field will attract the shadow. It will attract in a partner the shadow of, so it will bring in that into your field. And then remember, every other person has a Venus sequence as well. So they have all their shadows in their sequence and their gifts. Yeah, it's really interesting looking at the Venus sequence. And one of the things we do in the program is we look at how the chemistry between attractor fields interacts with each other. And it's something that in the future might become an app, because it's quite fun as well.
Oh, yes, please.
If a line 3 attracts a line 2, then you can look at the two shadow patterns. Like the line 2 is the one that can be aggressive, and the line 3 is the one that can run away. So you've got someone who's aggressive and someone who just runs.
Right.
Right. And that's the story of your arguments. Like one tries to be aggressive and the other's gone. Right? Probably even left the relationship.
Well, you're a 1. I'm
a 1.
Again.
So you have a 1 and a 4, and so you have a 1 that kind of hides and represses, and then a 4 that pushes and is cold when threatened. And so they reinforce each other. So you end up with these patterns but then if you look at them at the higher level, the 1 is.
I see something there. Okay, let me just interject this. If you have a 1 and a 4, and the shadow for yours on attraction is hunger, if someone is cold and rejecting you, it creates a hunger to be accepted and connected, right? Totally. So that's how your shadow might play out, say with a 4.
Totally. So when you understand the gene key, the line, the shadow, you get to see the story of your relationships, just written out. But you can, as you disable the difficult patterns through your awareness, you attract in different energies. That's the truth. That's where the law of attraction is correct. But you have to do the shadow work in order that you can attract in the higher frequency of another person. So you need to you'll attract in a person who also has self-awareness. And then you won't be meeting their shadow pattern all the time. You'll be meeting someone who has self-awareness, and someone who perhaps even has unlocked some of their siddhi, some of their highest energy. And whichever,
in an ideal situation, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And that's what happens when we fall in love, actually, because we meet each other's siddhis.
Yes.
We meet each other's highest essences.
Yeah.
And we see that. But then soon the wound comes in.
Oh, yeah.
because it hasn't been processed fully.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now we are going to go finally to purpose, which goes from attraction to purpose. And you're a 5-6, which has to do with timelessness, patience, and impatience. So 6 is your line in that. So let's talk about what that means, because this kind of finishes up the Venus sequence.
Yeah, and we've sort of gone backwards there, but
we've gone backwards.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Because it's a nice place to end and begin. Is the purpose, which if you look in your gene keys, your profile, you'll see it's the foundation of your first sequence called your activation sequence. And we call that core stability. It's where, you actually, unless you have done your inner work, how can you be in a relationship with another person? Because you don't have unless you know your sense of purpose inside your body, unless you can embody it. So mine is gene key 5, which is all about patience. So unless I can truly embody patience, and over the long term, then I can't be in a relationship with anyone, not clearly, because all I have is this hunger, this impatience, this restlessness, and that nothing's ever right. Nothing's ever right about this other person I'm with, or this, because there's always this restlessness in me. And unless I attend to that, and I learn the skill and art of patience and even timelessness, where I accept everything, then I can't be stable in a relationship. I can't. And if I can't be stable in a relationship, how am I going to ever, how is that relationship ever going to flower and be a good relationship? It can't be. So,
wonderful example.
So when you come to your purpose, that's what you come to. You come to a place in you that you have to come to deep acceptance of, and you have to tackle that shadow. And then as you do, you begin to feel your purpose and you're more of your soul inhabiting your body. And then you can be in a relationship with someone properly,
Okay. Then I'm going to give you mine. Mine is 49, which is rebirth, revolution, and reaction.
Yeah.
How does that play out?
Well, so
Briefly.
You will probably draw in with that powerful emotional people, that will likely provoke you or have and then that part of you that is the third line wound that wants to kind of run might play out the revolutionary component, and part of the story is, that revolution can either be a positive thing or it can be a negative. It can be a destructive thing. And so that 49 is all about coming to terms with, overcoming reaction patterns in relationships, emotional reaction patterns, and reaction patterns are in the chemistry between us. They're in the chemistry field.
So true.
Yeah. So it depends on what the chemistry is. There's this reaction that's provoked. And until you can work with those reaction patterns and disable them, you don't get to the rebirth. But if you're able to work with them over a long period of time, you get to the rebirth, and your rebirth is just that you're just stable inside yourself. You feel a sense of purpose. You're reborn in every moment.
Yeah.
Same person.
I feel reaction, and I feel that. And my line in that is a 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like me.
Yeah.
And so the 6 lines also have a certain story to them. They tend to mature later than other people. But when they do mature later in life, maybe after the 50s, they really come into their own. Then those people really flower in their elder years, like you are, like I am. We flower later than some. So early on, that could be good to know in your 20s, in your 30s, when everyone else is doing really well, and you're kind of thinking, well, I don't know, I feel like, I see behind here a bit. It just takes time. And so that 6 line, because it's very transcendent, and it has to go through all these different paradigms and patterns before it learns. So yeah, it's a part of the storyline.
It brings new meaning to my dad's probably the most painful thing he ever said to me. He's a very kind man my entire life. He said, "Honey child, you're a slow learner."
Exactly.
Oh, I was crushed.
And now you realize that's actually a gift. So once you kind of really understand your purpose in your own being, that's when you're ready to relate to another being. And that's the foundation of any healthy relationship. And that's what the Venus sequence journey is all about, getting us simply to that place where we know ourselves.
Absolutely beautiful. Richard, again, I'm just so grateful that you had this disconcerting download all those years ago that took over your life, took over your destiny, your direction, that made you turn your back on a very viable, lovely other career, family business to do this. That took a lot of courage, but how could you not? And we're all very appreciative of it. So we've just finished the Venus sequence. Okay. And here it's called Love. Golden Path Love. And I highly encourage people to dive into it. And we're going to finish off our series of conversations with the Pearl sequence. So if you could take just a moment to tell us what the Pearl sequence is about before we say goodbye.
Yeah. So in the journey, we've gone from activation sequence to Venus sequence and that's the Pearl, the next one. So you go from individual to relational to collective. And that's what the Pearl is. The Pearl is about the collective flowering of consciousness. And you can only get there once the heart has opened in the Venus sequence. So the heart has to open in order for us to get to true prosperity. And that's what the Pearl is, prosperity. So I always kind of joke sometimes when people say, "Can't I just get to prosperity without going through relationships?"
No.
You have to go through relationships and love. And that's what flowering is. Flowering then becomes collective, and then abundance starts to come. True abundance, not just money, just at every level. So the Pearl describes that incredible prospering as a collective. It's sort of the future of humanity. It shows us the future of humanity once love has fully opened up inside human beings. So it's really a crystal ball moment.
And in your book, let's see here. I have a bookmark here. You talk about where we're headed. We're talking about collectivity, the collective on a scale of consciousness. And this is page 121 in the Venus sequence. And what it says here, and I'll just read this and then we're going to say goodbye. It says, we are now moving to what is called the sixth race on the level of consciousness. The sixth race has long been prophesied by mystics and sages, corresponding to the involution of divine essence into the astral plane, the realm of emotion and desire. The sixth race will bring transformation to our entire planet. As divine consciousness continues to descend deeper and deeper into form, it reveals its true nature. The coming epoch will see the sublimation of human sexuality and desire into unconditional love. The sixth race will be triggered through the 55th gene key and its mutation within the solar plexus center, the seat of human emotion. The Trivian race heralds the reawakening of this center and will allow human beings to experience once again the universal quantum field connecting all beings. So that's what we're all attempting to move into as a species. So I will leave it on that. And then from there, we'll segue into the Pearl sequence next time. Richard, thank you so much. I so much enjoy our conversations. They give people permission to see. I think this body of work gives people permission to see and experience themselves in our entirety. Not just try to cherry pick the good stuff and run away from the bad stuff. And it does it in such a beautiful way. So again, thank you so much for joining me today and helping break down our love or Venus sequence.
Thanks, Regina. It's a pleasure.
Okay, everybody, till next time, you can always go to genekeys.com. There you can get your free profile and start probing into some of these things we spoke about today and all of the sequences. And then, of course, the books are available. And then Richard has a beautiful audio version of each of these keys and the lines through genekeys.com. So I'd say take a nice deep dive in. And also don't forget Art of Contemplation as a foundation. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on reginameredith.com. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you might also want to consider joining Patreon, which allows me to keep all of this content free and available to everyone. And if you're looking for like-minded souls, you might also enjoy my online community called Our Neighborhood. Links to join are in the description.